If the phrase loaded gun sounding just stopped you cold, hit subscribe to Orbital View. We are watching this setup hour by hour, and when the models update, when the SMPC issues new products, when this story moves, we will be here with the data. Drop your city or county in the comments. I want to know who is in or near this corridor this weekend. I read every one. 3 threads. An atmospheric configuration so rare that the Storm Prediction Center deploys a designation most forecasters go entire careers without seeing on a setup this intense, and the specific parameters behind it that have the research community on alert. The outbreak of April 3rd and 4th, 1974, the last time a loaded gun environment of this caliber was primed over the Ohio Valley, and what it produced in a single 24-hour period. And the factor that makes this weekend's setup more dangerous than the historical cases most people are aware of: the terrain, the trees, and the demographics sitting underneath the forecast corridor. Let's get into it.
The Storm Prediction Center does not use the phrase particularly dangerous situation often. That is by design. The PDS designation exists precisely because its value depends on scarcity. When the SPC attaches those 3 words to a tornado watch, it is not emphasizing, it is communicating a category. A PDS tornado watch means the atmospheric parameters fall into the uppermost tier of tornado outbreak environments. The tier where the historical record shows not isolated significant tornadoes, but widespread, long-track, violent events capable of EF4 and EF5 intensity. Most years, a PDS watch is issued fewer than 5 times across the entire United States. Some years, fewer than that. The watch has been issued for the Ohio Valley corridor this weekend. I want to walk you through exactly what that means in operational terms, because the PDS designation is doing something specific that a standard severe thunderstorm or tornado watch does not do. It is communicating risk tier, not just risk presence. And understanding the tier is understanding why the meteorological community is treating this setup with a level of attention usually reserved for events that get named in textbooks afterward. Right now, the SPC's Day 1 and Day 2 convective outlooks have elevated portions of the Ohio Valley into high risk, the top category on the SPC scale, a designation that is issued for fewer than 2% of severe weather days nationally. The area forecast discussions coming out of NWS Indianapolis, NWS Louisville, NWS Pittsburgh, and NWS Cleveland are converging on language that, in operational terms, is extraordinary. Not the standard, conditions will be favorable for severe weather. Language about the potential for violent and long-track tornadoes. Language about life-threatening situations. Language that experienced forecasters reserve for the setups they remember for the rest of their careers. The geographic footprint of the highest risk area runs from the lower Ohio Valley northeast through central and eastern Indiana, across Kentucky and Ohio into western Pennsylvania and West Virginia. That corridor is not rural, it is not agricultural, it contains Indianapolis, Louisville, Columbus, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh. Major metropolitan areas with millions of residents, dense suburban and exurban development extending into forested terrain, and a residential building stock that, unlike the Great Plains, was never designed or cited with tornado risk as a primary consideration. And the atmospheric parameters underneath this forecast are not marginal. They are not could support severe weather. They are, in the language of the researchers who study outbreak environments, extreme. But before I tell you what those parameters are and what they mean, I need to tell you something about how the atmosphere has been behaving for the past several days. Because the setup that is now arriving at the Ohio Valley did not appear suddenly. It has been building. And the building process is the first piece of the story that most coverage is missing entirely. For the past 4 to 5 days, a ridge of high pressure has been sitting over the Gulf of Mexico and the southeastern United States, pumping anomalously warm and moist air northward ahead of an approaching trough from the west. Surface dew points across Kentucky and Indiana have been running in the upper 60s to low 70s Fahrenheit, values more typical of mid-July than late spring in this region. That moisture has been loading the lower atmosphere like water filling a tank, slowly, steadily out of sight of the surface observer who looks outside and sees a warm, hazy, unremarkable day. Simultaneously, at the 300 to 500 millibar level, roughly the jet stream level, 25,000 to 35,000 feet above the surface, a powerful upper-level trough has been digging into the western United States. The jet stream associated with that trough is accelerating. It is beginning to interact with the moisture-loaded atmosphere over the Ohio Valley. And the combination of those two features, the warm, moist, unstable air mass below and the energetic upper-level flow above, is what creates the environment the operational meteorologists are watching with the kind of attention I want to describe to you in detail. Because the atmosphere right now is a loaded gun, and the cold front approaching from the west is the trigger. Every tornado requires two ingredients: energy and rotation. Without enough of either, you get a thunderstorm. With enough of both aligned in the right way, you get what the historical record calls a violent tornado outbreak. The energy variable has a name: convective available potential energy, CAPE. Before I give you the technical definition, let me give you the physical one, because the physical one is the one that matters. Imagine the lower atmosphere as a compressed spring. The warm, moist air near the surface wants to rise. It is less dense than the air above it. But in the days before a major severe weather outbreak, the atmosphere frequently develops what researchers call a cap, a thin layer of slightly warmer air sitting a few thousand feet above the surface that suppresses convection. That cap is the hand holding the spring down. The longer the cap holds, the more energy accumulates below it. The more energy accumulates, the more violent the release when the cap finally breaks. CAPE measures the energy available in that compressed spring, specifically how much buoyancy a rising parcel of air would have if it were able to punch through the cap and begin its ascent. The units are joules per kilogram, and the scale matters. Values below 1,000 joules per kilogram are considered moderate. Values between 1,000 and 2,500 are significant. Values above 3,000 are extreme. Values above 4,000 are the kind that appear in the parameter space of the most violent tornado outbreaks in the historical record. The current analysis across the Ohio Valley corridor is showing CAPE values of 3,500 to 5,000 joules per kilogram in the warm sector. I need you to hold that number because it is doing a great deal of work in this forecast. 5,000 joules per kilogram is not a rounding error above the extreme threshold. It is the threshold for what some researchers call loaded gun soundings. Atmospheric profiles in which so much energy has accumulated below the cap that when the cap breaks, the updraft velocity in the resulting thunderstorm is not merely fast. It is terrifying. Harold Brooks at NOAA's National Severe Storms Laboratory has published work on the relationship between CAPE values and tornado intensity. What his research and the broader severe weather literature establish is that the most violent tornadoes, the EF4 and EF5 events that produce catastrophic, often unsurvivable damage, are statistically associated with environments where CAPE and wind shear are simultaneously extreme. Not just high, extreme. The two parameters together create a multiplicative effect that neither one produces alone, which brings us to the rotation variable, wind shear. Think about what makes a top spin. You twist the stem, you apply rotation at the surface, while the top itself is moving vertically. Atmospheric wind shear works on the same principle. When the wind speed increases dramatically with height, slow near the surface, fast at altitude, and when the wind direction also changes with height, typically veering from southerly at the surface to southwesterly at mid-levels to westerly at upper levels, the atmosphere develops horizontal tubes of rotating air. These tubes are invisible. They are embedded in the atmosphere's wind field. And when a thunderstorm's updraft tilts those tubes from horizontal to vertical, it converts background atmospheric rotation into the concentrated, organized rotation of a supercell thunderstorm. The measure of this rotation potential is called storm relative helicity, SRH. Values above 150 meters squared per second squared are considered significant. Values above 300 are associated with significant tornado potential. Values above 450, which some modeling guidance is showing for portions of the Ohio Valley corridor this weekend, represent the upper end of what the climatological record associates with major tornado outbreaks. 5,000 joules per kilogram of CAPE, 450 meters squared per second squared of helicity, both extreme, both simultaneously present in the same corridor. Greg Carbon, formerly of the Storm Prediction Center, has described environments like this one as possessing what forecasters sometimes call violent tornado potential. Not just tornado potential, but the potential for the kind of tornado that the enhanced Fujita scale's top two categories describe. EF4 winds begin at 166 miles per hour. EF5 winds exceed 200 miles per hour. These are not the tornadoes that damage roofs and snap trees. These are the tornadoes that remove well-constructed frame homes from their foundations, that strip the bark from trees, that move cars and trucks hundreds of yards. And the cap, the hand holding the spring down, is still holding, for now. The cap is the most operationally consequential feature of this setup. And the way it behaves over the next 12 to 18 hours will determine whether the energy loading in the Ohio Valley atmosphere releases as a manageable severe weather event or as a major tornado outbreak. Here is why the cap matters so much. When the cap holds through the afternoon hours, when convection is suppressed long enough for the atmosphere to continue loading, the storms that eventually initiate after cap break are discrete, isolated. individual supercell thunderstorms, rather than the disorganized clusters or squall lines that form when convection erupts too early before the energy concentrates. Discrete supercells are the tornado factories. They are not the most common severe weather mode, they are the most dangerous. An organized supercell has a persistent rotating updraft, the mesocyclone, that maintains its structure for hours. It can track hundreds of miles. It can produce a tornado that stays on the ground for 100 miles or more. The tornadoes associated with major outbreaks, the Joplin 2011 event, the April 27, 2011 Alabama outbreak, the April 3 and 4, 1974 Super Outbreak, were all predominantly supercell produced. The current atmospheric setup has the ingredients for discrete supercell initiation along the approaching cold front in the afternoon hours. The SPC's high-risk area is timed around a window of discrete supercell potential that overlaps directly with the peak instability. The period when CAPE is highest and wind shear is maximized by the accelerating upper-level jet. But there is a second initiation window that is receiving less attention in public coverage, and it is the one that concerns me more from a life safety perspective: overnight. The low-level jet, the same nocturnal wind maximum I described in the context of the Ring of Fire derecho setup, accelerates dramatically after sunset across the Ohio Valley during this type of pattern. Wind speeds at the 850 millibar level frequently exceed 60 to 70 knots during major outbreak setups, arriving well after dark. That nocturnal acceleration does two things. It dramatically increases the low-level wind shear, the parameter most directly associated with tornado formation and intensity within already established supercells. And it provides the energy source for squall line development and quasi-linear convective system organization, which can produce a rapid transition from discrete supercells to a messy, fast-moving storm mode that is harder to warn and harder for the public to respond to. The historical record on overnight tornadoes is sobering. Research by Ashley, Kremanek, and Schwantes, published in 2008 in the journal Weather and Forecasting, established that tornadoes occurring between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. Local time produced 2.5 times the fatality rate of equivalent intensity daytime tornadoes. 2.5 times. The physical damage is identical. The fatality rate is not. Because a sleeping population in an era before widespread wireless emergency alerts and consistent outdoor warning siren networks in residential areas does not respond with the same speed and effectiveness that a daytime population does. The Storm Prediction Center operational products for this weekend include explicit language about the overnight severe weather threat. The NWS Louisville and NWS Indianapolis area forecast discussions have both flagged the nocturnal window, but flagging it and communicating it in a way that produces behavior change, that gets people in Louisville, in Columbus, in Pittsburgh, to have a plan for 3 in the morning are two different things. The cap will break, the initiation will happen. The question is when, in what mode, and over which specific counties. And those specifics are exactly what the next 48 hours of model output and observational data will narrow. Pull up a topographic and land cover map of the Ohio Valley. Then compare it to the map you have in your head of tornado country, the Great Plains of Kansas and Oklahoma and Texas, the open agricultural terrain where a tornado's track is visible from miles away and a farmhouse sits in a cleared field with an unobstructed view of the sky. The Ohio Valley is not that. The Ohio Valley and surrounding terrain is forested, heavily in many areas. The Appalachian foothills extending into eastern Ohio, western Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. The mixed hardwood forests of Kentucky and southern Indiana. The suburban and exurban development that has pushed into that terrain over the past 30 years. Residential subdivisions cut into hillsides, cul-de-sac developments tucked into valleys. Neighborhoods where the mature tree canopy that makes a community beautiful in summer is the same canopy that prevents a resident from seeing a tornado bearing down on them until it is 400 yards away. This matters for tornado outcomes in a way that the parameters alone do not capture. On the Great Plains, a farmer standing in a field can see a tornado forming on the horizon at 10 miles distance and have time to make decisions. In a forested residential corridor in Ohio or Kentucky or western Pennsylvania, the visual warning that is the Great Plains survivor's first line of defense does not exist. The trees close off the sight lines. The terrain folds the landscape. The tornado is in the next clearing before anyone in the affected neighborhood has seen anything. The second structural vulnerability is the housing stock. The residential buildings across the Ohio Valley, and particularly in the suburban and exurban zones where population density is highest, are predominantly wood frame construction. Brick veneer over wood frame over slab. These are not the poorly constructed mobile homes that account for a disproportionate share of tornado fatalities, but they are also not the steel reinforced construction that survives EF4 and EF5 winds intact. A well-built frame home in a direct hit from an EF4 tornado does not protect its occupants the way a purpose-built shelter or a reinforced concrete interior room does. The walls fail, the roof fails. The structure that was supposed to provide protection becomes the debris field. Kevin Simmons and Daniel Sutter published research in 2011 on the factors driving tornado fatality rates, and one of their central findings was that mobile home and wood frame residential housing stock, particularly in regions with lower historical tornado awareness, shows significantly elevated fatality rates per tornado compared to regions where the population has grown up with shelter awareness, regular tornado drill culture, and purpose-built safe rooms. The Ohio Valley has less of that embedded awareness than the Great Plains. Not zero, but less. The cultural relationship with tornado risk is different. The Great Plains community has generations of tornado experience, community storm spotters, family shelter plans, and safe room installations that reflect a lived understanding of the threat. Portions of the Ohio Valley corridor, particularly the suburban and exurban zones that have grown rapidly in the past 2 to 3 decades, have populations that have not experienced a violent, long-track tornado in their lifetimes, or ever. And the trees mean that by the time the first visual warning is available, the decision window may already have closed. The most important historical case for understanding what this weekend's setup is capable of producing is not Joplin 2011. It is not April 27, 2011. It is the event that defined the category, the Super Outbreak of April 3rd and 4th, 1974. Over a 24-hour period beginning on the afternoon of April 3rd, 148 confirmed tornadoes touched down across 13 states. 30 tornadoes were rated F4 or F5 on the original Fujita scale. 6 of them tracked more than 100 miles. Combined, the outbreak killed 315 people and injured more than 5,000. It remains one of the most studied severe weather events in the historical record, not because of its death toll, which subsequent events in more populated areas have approached or exceeded, but because of its atmospheric signature. And that signature looks remarkably similar to what the current analysis is showing over the Ohio Valley. The April 3rd, 1974 environment featured extreme CAPE in the warm sector, a persistent cap that held through the early afternoon and allowed the atmosphere to maximize its energy loading before convective initiation, a potent upper-level trough driving intense vertical wind shear, and a low-level jet that accelerated dramatically after sunset, producing a violent nocturnal phase that extended the outbreak well past what many forecasters had anticipated. Ted Fujita, the researcher who developed the original tornado intensity scale and who personally surveyed the 1974 outbreak damage, documented something in his post-event analysis that has direct relevance to this weekend. He found that the tornadoes in the 1974 outbreak consistently achieved their maximum intensity over forested and rolling terrain, not because the terrain enhanced the tornado itself, but because the tornado in forested terrain was not visually detectable by its intended victims until it was within a few hundred yards. The forest concealed the approach. The outcome was that people who had adequate warning time in terms of minutes failed to use that time effectively because the visual confirmation they were waiting for did not arrive until it was too late. The super outbreak also produced something that the raw tornado count does not convey: family F-scale profiles. Multiple tornadoes in the outbreak initiated as discrete supercells in the afternoon and tracked for extraordinary distances. The Xenia, Ohio tornado tracked approximately 32 miles and killed 34 people. The Brandenburg, Kentucky tornado killed 31. These were not brief touchdowns. These were organized, long-track supercell tornadoes in exactly the mode that the current atmospheric setup is primed to produce. The 1974 outbreak occurred over a corridor that substantially overlaps with the current forecast high-risk area. Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, the Ohio Valley, not the Great Plains. The same terrain, the same forested residential environment, the same visibility limitations that this weekend's population faces. And here is the piece of this historical case that I find most important for understanding the current setup. The 1974 outbreak produced the outcomes it did in an era before Doppler radar, before dual polarization radar, before the HER model, before wireless emergency alerts, before widespread internet access to real-time radar data. The population of Xenia, Ohio in April of 1974 had fundamentally less warning infrastructure than the population of the Ohio Valley in 2025 or 26.
That does not make the current threat less serious. It means the question is not whether the warning will reach people. The question is whether the warning will produce the behavior that keeps people alive. In a forested, suburban, residentially dense corridor at potentially 2 or 3 in the morning, with an EF4 or EF5 tornado moving at 50 miles per hour, That question does not have a comfortable answer. It has an urgent one.
And this is where the story takes a turn that most of the coverage around this setup has not fully explored. Because the atmospheric parameters I have described, the CAPE, the shear, the cap, are the inputs. What I want to show you now is the output. What those inputs produce inside a mature supercell thunderstorm. Because understanding the machinery is understanding why the researchers who study this are not using words like significant or notable. They are using the word violent. A supercell thunderstorm is not a thunderstorm that has grown large. It is a thunderstorm that has achieved a specific organizational structure, a structure that makes it capable of sustaining itself for hours and producing the most extreme weather events the atmosphere generates short of a tropical cyclone. The defining feature is the mesocyclone, a rotating updraft, rotating because the wind shear in the environment has tilted those horizontal tubes of spinning air into the vertical and ingested them into the storm's core. The mesocyclone is the engine. It draws warm, moist, unstable air from the boundary layer into the storm at extraordinary rates, feeding the updraft, sustaining the rotation, maintaining the structure. In an extreme CAPE environment, the kind the Ohio Valley corridor is facing this weekend, the updraft velocity inside a mature supercell is not merely fast. Research by Matthew Kumjian at Penn State and others studying supercell kinematics has established that in environments with CAPE above 4,000 joules per kilogram, estimated updraft velocities can exceed 150 miles per hour vertically. 150 miles per hour moving upward inside the storm's core. Hailstones that would normally fall under gravity are suspended in that updraft, growing as they cycle through the storm's ice-rich regions, before finally exceeding the updraft's sustaining capacity and falling to Earth. That is the same updraft that at its base produces the rotating wall cloud, the lowered portion of the storm's base that marks the mesocyclone's lowest extent. And when that mesocyclone tightens, when the rotation concentrates from a column 2 or 3 miles wide into a column of a few hundred yards, when the principle of angular momentum conservation accelerates the rotation as its radius decreases, the way a figure skater pulls their arms inward. What emerges from the base of the wall cloud is a tornado. In an environment with the shear values currently present over the Ohio Valley, SRH approaching 450 meters squared per second squared, the probability that a mature supercell produces a significant tornado, EF2 or greater, is not a marginal probability. Research published by the NOAA Storm Prediction Center's own climatological team has established that environments combining extreme CAPE and extreme SRH produce significant tornadoes in a substantial fraction of supercell occurrences. The fraction varies with the specific values and the storm's life cycle, but in the parameter space this weekend's setup occupies, the question for a mature supercell is not whether it will tornado. It is how intense and how long track. Long track tornadoes, those that maintain contact with the ground for more than 25 miles, are not randomly distributed across the parameter space. They occur preferentially in environments with very high CAPE and very high low-level shear, because those are the environments that sustain the supercell mesocyclone for hours rather than minutes. The tornado does not reform with each new rotation cycle. It maintains, it intensifies. It follows the storm's track for a distance that, in the most extreme cases, exceeds 100 miles. The tri-state tornado of March 18, 1925, tracked approximately 219 miles across Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana. That event predates the modern understanding of supercell dynamics, but its atmospheric signature, reconstructed from available surface observation data by researchers including Robert Johns, was consistent with an extreme shear, extreme instability environment similar in character to this weekend's setup. It killed 695 people. It remains the deadliest tornado in United States history. The current setup is not a forecast of the tri-state tornado. No specific event is forecastable at that level of resolution days in advance. But the parameter space that produces long-track violent tornadoes is the parameter space that is present. And that is precisely what the PDS designation is communicating. The event most researchers use as the modern reference point for a high-end Ohio Valley and Southeast outbreak environment is April 27, 2011. Not because it is the most relevant in terms of atmospheric parameters. The current setup has similarities to both 2011 and 1974. But because it is the most thoroughly documented, the most analyzed, and the one that produced outcomes in a modern warning and response environment that are directly comparable to what this weekend's population faces. On April 27, 2011, 217 tornadoes touched down across the southeastern United States in a single day. 62 of them were rated EF3 or higher. 11 were rated EF4 or EF5. The outbreak killed 252 people in Alabama alone. 324 people died across the affected region in total. And this happened in the modern warning era. This happened with Doppler radar networks operational, with wireless emergency alerts in deployment, with the NWS issuing tornado warnings with lead times averaging 14 to 16 minutes. The warning system worked, the warnings went out, and 324 people died. James Ledoux at the Warning Decision Training Division studied the 2011 outbreak outcomes in detail, and what his analysis found is important for understanding what the warning system can and cannot do in a high-end outbreak environment. The warnings were issued. The lead times were adequate for shelter decisions in most cases. But in an environment producing multiple simultaneous long-track tornadoes across a large geographic area, the saturation of warning products. The sheer number of warnings being broadcast simultaneously across multiple counties creates a psychological numbing effect that reduces behavioral response compared to isolated warning events. When every county in a region is under a tornado warning simultaneously, the warning stops functioning as a signal and starts functioning as background noise. Jonathan Kaplan and colleagues published research specifically examining this warning saturation effect in outbreak environments, and it has direct relevance to this weekend. The Ohio Valley corridor under the current forecast is large. The number of potentially simultaneous supercells capable of producing tornadoes within a multi-county area is significant. The probability that the warning system will be issuing dozens of overlapping, simultaneous tornado warnings across multiple NWS county warning areas during the peak threat window is real. And the behavioral response to the 43rd tornado warning of the afternoon is not the same as the behavioral response to the first. The 2011 outbreak also illuminated what happens to damage surveys in forested terrain. Dr. Greg Forbes at the Weather Channel, who has studied hundreds of tornado events, documented that EF-scale damage ratings in forested areas are systematically harder to establish than in agricultural or suburban areas because the indicator structures, frame homes, commercial buildings, utility poles, are less uniformly distributed across forested terrain. Tornadoes in forests cause destruction that is visually dramatic but difficult to rate precisely. Trees are debarked, snapped, or uprooted in patterns that researchers use to estimate wind speeds, but these patterns carry more uncertainty than structural damage indicators. The practical implication is that the EF ratings assigned to tornadoes in forested terrain may underestimate actual wind speeds, and that the Ohio Valley's forested residential corridor could produce damage events whose intensity is underreported in the official record. That is not a comfortable finding for a setup like this one. The tornado threat is the headline of this setup. But there is a compound threat embedded in the same parameter space that I want to address directly, because its interaction with the tornado threat creates a specific operational problem that compounds the danger. In an extreme cape environment with strong deep layer shear, not just the low-level shear that drives tornado rotation, but the shear extending through the full depth of the troposphere, supercell thunderstorms also produce large to giant hail. Significant hail, baseball-sized and above. In some extreme cape environments, grapefruit-sized hail has been documented. Hail of that magnitude is an independent life safety threat. But in the context of this weekend's outbreak setup, the hail threat creates a specific compound problem. It drives people indoors before the tornado warning is issued. This sounds like a good thing. It is not, necessarily. When a large hail-producing storm approaches a residential area, the behavioral response is often to shelter in an interior room on the ground floor, which is exactly the right behavior for a tornado warning. But when the next storm cell in a line of supercells approaches 20 minutes later, the population that successfully sheltered for the first storm may have already returned to normal activity. The repeated shelter and return cycle across a multi-hour outbreak window produces fatigue. Each shelter event feels like the previous one, and the previous one did not produce a tornado. The behavioral psychology of repeated false alarms, or repeated events that produce severe weather but not a tornado in the observer's immediate location, is one of the most significant factors in outbreak fatality rates. Fred Osby, who spent decades at the Storm Prediction Center studying outbreak dynamics, documented the phenomenon of what he called warning fatigue, the tendency for populations experiencing repeated severe weather warnings over multiple hours to show progressively reduced shelter compliance as the event continues. The problem is most acute in the multi-hour outbreak window, exactly the time frame this weekend's setup is generating. The practical advice is simple, and I want to state it as plainly as I can. If you are in or near the high-risk area this weekend, the right strategy is not to wait for the tornado warning in your county. The right strategy is to have your shelter location identified and accessible before the storm mode begins. before the first warning of the day, and to treat every severe thunderstorm warning in your area during the outbreak window as a cue to position yourself near that shelter. Not in it necessarily, near it. Because the time between a severe thunderstorm warning and a tornado warning in an active supercell environment can be very short. And in forested terrain where visual confirmation arrives late, short is not enough. The NWS offices covering this corridor, NWS Indianapolis, NWS Louisville, NWS Pittsburgh, NWS Cleveland, NWS Jackson, have all issued or are preparing to issue specific public information statements about this weekend's threat. Read them, share them. The operational forecasters staffing those offices during this event are some of the most experienced severe weather forecasters in the country. And what they are putting in those statements is the distillation of their professional assessment of a setup they are taking extremely seriously. A tornado outbreak of the scale this setup is capable of producing does not just damage homes along individual storm tracks. It systematically degrades the infrastructure that makes emergency response possible, and does so across a geographic area large enough that the degradation affects multiple simultaneous response situations at once. The power grid across the Ohio Valley and Appalachian region faces the same aging infrastructure problem I described in the derecho context, with one additional vulnerability specific to the terrain. The transmission lines crossing the forested Ohio Valley and Appalachian terrain run through areas where right-of-way maintenance, the clearing of trees and vegetation from the corridor beneath and around the lines, is more difficult, more expensive, and more frequently deferred than in the open agricultural terrain of the plains. The result is that transmission lines in this region are more susceptible to damage from falling trees than equivalent lines in flat, open terrain. A tornado does not need to make a direct hit on a transmission tower to bring a line down. A wide debris field from a long-track tornado, trees snapped or uprooted across a swath a mile wide and 50 miles long, produces tree-on-line contacts that can cascade through the distribution network far from the tornado's actual track. The American Society of Civil Engineers 2023 Infrastructure Assessment rated the Ohio region's transmission infrastructure in the same aging category as the broader national grid. But the specific tree contact vulnerability in forested terrain elevates the practical outage probability above what the equipment age alone would suggest. Cellular infrastructure in this corridor carries the same backup power limitations I described previously, 4 to 8 hours of battery backup in many rural and exurban tower sites. When a major tornado outbreak produces widespread power outages across a multi-county area, the cellular towers in the affected zone begin drawing down those battery reserves immediately. Within 4 to 8 hours of the initial outage, the wireless emergency alert system, the primary mechanism for reaching sleeping residents in the overnight window, begins to degrade in coverage exactly as the nocturnal tornado threat window opens. And then there is the road network. The Ohio Valley and Appalachian terrain creates a road network that is fundamentally more vulnerable to storm debris blockage than the flat grid of plains roads. Mountain roads, valley roads, single-access subdivision roads. These are corridors where a single downed tree or power line blocks the only route in or out. Emergency response vehicles cannot reach residents in those areas. Residents in those areas cannot self-evacuate if the situation deteriorates. The forested terrain that limits visual tornado detection also limits post-event access for search and rescue, utility restoration crews, and emergency medical response. The compound consequence of a long-track violent tornado in this terrain is not just the damage along the track. It is the isolation of the populations on either side of the track, cut off by the debris field from both external help and self-directed escape. In the 2011 Alabama outbreak, first responders in some rural areas could not reach tornado-damaged sites for 12 to 24 hours because the debris fields blocked road access. In the Ohio Valley's more complex terrain, that timeline could be longer.
None of this is a reason for panic. It is a reason for preparation. Specifically, know your shelter location before the event begins. Have a battery-powered or hand-crank weather radio that does not depend on the cellular network for alerts. Know the road network well enough to identify alternative routes if your primary road is blocked. And if you are in the forecast corridor, make the decisions you need to make about travel, about outdoor plans, about where you will be and where your family will be before Saturday afternoon, not during it.
I want to spend some time on the warning system in this chunk because it is doing more work this weekend than it was designed to do. And understanding what it does and does not guarantee is, I think, the most practically important thing this investigation can offer. The NWS tornado warning system has improved dramatically over the past 2 decades. That is not marketing language, it is a measurable fact. The integration of dual polarization radar data into operational warning decision-making has given forecasters the ability to identify rotation signatures and debris signatures, the tornado debris signature, or TDS, which appears on dual pol radar as a distinct marker of actual ground contact, with a specificity that was impossible with single polarization radar. The HER model runs every hour at 1 kilometer resolution, providing mesoscale guidance that helps forecasters anticipate where initiation is most likely before it occurs. The Warn-On Forecast Research Program at NOAA's National Severe Storms Laboratory, led for years by David Stensrud, is working toward probabilistic, storm-scale tornado warnings that would extend lead times beyond the current 14 to 22-minute operational average. 14 to 22 minutes, that is the average. In a high-end outbreak with a well-analyzed storm environment, the best-case lead time for an individual tornado warning can exceed 30 minutes. In a rapidly evolving situation with a fast-moving storm mode transition from discrete supercells to a messy squall line configuration, it can be less than 5. And here's the operational reality that I think deserves to be stated plainly. The NWS tornado warning system is optimized for the single event case. A supercell approaching an isolated community, tracked by a clear radar return, with a single warning coordination meteorologist focused on that storm's evolution. In a high-end outbreak, there is no single event case. There are dozens of simultaneous supercells, each requiring its own warning decision, each tracked by a different forecaster at a different NWS County Warning Area office, each moving through terrain that overlaps the warning jurisdiction of multiple offices simultaneously. The NWS Louisville office, one of the primary offices responsible for the outbreak corridor this weekend, serves a county warning area that extends across multiple states and dozens of counties. During a major outbreak, the forecasters in that office may be simultaneously tracking 5 successful supercells, each one capable of producing a tornado, each one requiring a warning decision that must be made in minutes. The staffing protocols for high-impact events call for surge staffing, additional forecasters brought in to share the load. But surge staffing at midnight, when the nocturnal threat window peaks, is harder to maintain than surge staffing at 4 in the afternoon. Harold Brooks at NOAA's National Severe Storms Laboratory published a finding that I think about whenever I look at a setup like this one. He established that across the historical tornado record, the probability of death from a tornado that strikes an occupied structure varies not just with the tornado's intensity, but with the population's advanced knowledge and shelter-seeking behavior. In environments where the population receives specific warning and acts on it by moving to the lowest floor interior room away from windows, the fatality rate for even violent tornadoes drops substantially. The warning system's job is to give people that advanced knowledge. Its effectiveness depends entirely on what people do with it. That is the part of the system that no operational meteorologist controls. And in a high-end outbreak, with warning fatigue, with overnight timing, with forested terrain limiting visual confirmation, that is the part of the system that is most under stress this weekend. The Joplin, Missouri tornado of May 22, 2011 is not the most relevant atmospheric analog for this weekend's setup. It was a single discrete event rather than a multi-cell outbreak, and the atmospheric parameters were broadly comparable to, but not identical with the Ohio Valley's current environment. But in terms of understanding the gap between warning issuance and behavioral response, Joplin is the most thoroughly studied case in the modern record, and its findings are directly applicable to any high-end tornado threat scenario. The Joplin tornado killed 158 people. It was rated EF5. It was on the ground for approximately 22 miles. The NWS Springfield office issued the tornado warning with approximately 24 minutes of lead time before the tornado struck Joplin. 24 minutes is a long lead time by operational standards. It was not enough. The sociological study commissioned by the NWS after the event, conducted by researchers including Susan Jocelyn and Sharona Murillo at the University of Washington, found something that has fundamentally changed how emergency management professionals think about warning communication. Many of the people who died in Joplin had received the warning. They had heard the sirens. And they chose not to seek shelter immediately, not because they were reckless, but because they were applying a rational, experience-based decision framework that happened to be wrong in this specific case. The reasoning went like this. I have heard tornado sirens before. Every time I have heard tornado sirens before, nothing happened to my immediate location. Therefore, the sirens are not a reliable signal that I need to act immediately. I will wait for visual confirmation. In Joplin, visual confirmation arrived approximately 90 seconds before impact. 90 seconds is not enough time to reach shelter in a multi-story commercial building or a large residential structure. It is particularly not enough time if the person receiving that visual confirmation is on an upper floor, is mobility limited, or is in a structure where the basement or shelter space requires significant travel. The academic term for the decision framework those individuals were applying is bias combined with a cry wolf effect, the tendency to discount warnings after repeated non-events at a personal location. Nicole Ayrson and Kimberly Klockow-McLean at the NOAA Weather Program Office have published research on this behavioral pattern specifically in the context of high-end tornado warnings, and their finding is important. The PDS designation, the particularly dangerous situation label, was in part developed to address the cry wolf problem. It signals not just that a tornado watch is in effect, but that this watch is categorically different from the routine watches that have preceded it without producing events at any given individual's location. Whether that signal lands, whether the people in the Ohio Valley corridor this weekend hear PDS Tornado Watch and understand it as a categorical upgrade rather than another routine watch, is the operational unknown. And it is the unknown that the meteorologists watching this setup lose sleep over. I am going to tell you as plainly as I can what the PDS designation means in behavioral terms. It means the environment is consistent with the production of violent long-track tornadoes, EF4 and EF5. These are not the tornadoes that damage roofs. These are the tornadoes that remove frame homes from their foundations. If one of those tornadoes tracks over your neighborhood while you are waiting for visual confirmation, the outcome is not something the warning system can prevent after the fact. The window for action is before the storm arrives. The window is now. Setups like this one, a rare high-end atmospheric configuration arriving over a populated region, reliably produce a specific class of alternative explanation online. I want to address the most common ones directly, because the people asking deserve a real answer, and because the real answer contains something genuinely important. The primary claims circulating around this setup are variants of two themes. First, the extreme atmospheric parameters, the CAPE values, the shear, the PDS environment, are artificially engineered. HARP or some equivalent directed energy program has manipulated the jet stream or the moisture field to produce this outbreak. Second, the specific timing and targeting of the outbreak, arriving over a densely populated corridor on a weekend, is not coincidental. The physics of the first claim is unambiguous. HARP's maximum output is 3.6 megawatts, applied to the ionosphere at altitudes above 60 miles. The energy involved in the atmospheric circulation patterns producing this weekend's outbreak, the jet stream configuration, the Gulf moisture transport, the thermodynamic gradient across the boundary is measured in petajoules. A petajoule is 10 to the 15th joules. HARP's total energy budget, sustained continuously for months, would not approach the energy content of a single day's circulation pattern. The mechanism and the scale are both wrong by orders of magnitude that make the claim physically incoherent. The timing argument, that the storm's weekend arrival indicates deliberate targeting, requires a claim about atmospheric steering that is equally unsupported. Large-scale atmospheric circulation patterns evolve according to the same thermodynamic and fluid dynamic principles that meteorologists have been modeling mathematically since the 1960s. The models predicted this setup's timing and positioning days in advance, not because anyone engineered it, but because the differential equations governing large-scale atmospheric flow are well understood, and the initial conditions were in the observational record. Weekend timing is not suspicious. It is a coincidence. Severe weather outbreaks have no knowledge of the calendar. But here is what I want to say carefully, because there is something buried inside the concern that drives these questions that is not entirely wrong. The concern that human activity is making severe weather events more frequent and more intense in populated areas is not a conspiracy theory. It is an active area of peer-reviewed research. Victor Gensini and Harold Brooks published a study in 2018 in NPJ Climate and Atmospheric Science documenting a statistically significant eastward and northward shift in tornado activity across the United States over the past several decades. Away from the traditional tornado alley of the Great Plains and toward what researchers are now calling Dixie Alley and the Ohio Valley corridor. The mechanism is consistent with changing atmospheric circulation patterns under warming. Not engineering, not directed energy, not ionospheric manipulation. Just the documented, measurable, peer-reviewed consequence of a changing climate on the atmospheric environment that produces severe convective storms. If that shift is real and the observational data supports it, then the populations of the Ohio Valley are facing a tornado threat that is genuinely more frequent than their grandparents experienced. Not because of HARP, because of physics, because of the accumulated consequence of atmospheric composition changes that are well documented in the scientific record. The conspiracy explanation is wrong. The real explanation is more consequential, not less. The Gensini and Brooks 2018 study is worth spending more time on because it is directly relevant to the question of why the Ohio Valley is facing a high-end tornado outbreak this weekend and what that means for the communities in this corridor going forward. Traditional tornado climatology placed the highest historical frequencies of significant tornadoes in the southern Great Plains, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, a region that earned the colloquial designation Tornado Alley through decades of documented outbreak activity. That geography made intuitive sense. The Great Plains provides the flat terrain, the direct pathway for Gulf moisture, the dry line that separates moist and dry air masses, and the upper-level jet stream positioning that together create classic supercell environments with high frequency. But the 2018 Gensini and Brooks study, analyzing tornado occurrence data from 1979 through 2017, found a statistically significant trend. Tornado activity, particularly significant tornado activity at EF1 and above, has been shifting eastward and northeastward. The traditional tornado alley states show flat or declining trends in significant tornado frequency. The Ohio Valley, the Tennessee Valley, and the Mid-South, what researchers now call Dixie Alley, show increasing trends. The shift is not large enough to move the annual expected totals dramatically, but it is consistent and statistically robust. The mechanism Gensini and Brooks propose connects to the changing large-scale circulation pattern under a warming climate. Specifically, changes in the upper-level ridge trough structure and the frequency of patterns that direct Gulf moisture into the Ohio Valley and southeast rather than the Central Plains. It is an area of ongoing research, not a settled conclusion. Other researchers have noted the statistical challenges in tornado climatology, where changes in reporting density and detection technology can create apparent trends that reflect observation changes rather than physical changes. Gensini and Brooks accounted for these factors in their methodology, but the debate in the scientific literature continues. What I can say with confidence is that the observational record, taken at face value, shows more significant tornado events in the Ohio Valley and Dixie Alley corridor over the past 2 to 3 decades than the historical average for those regions. Whether that reflects a real physical shift or a complex mix of physical change and observational improvement is genuinely uncertain. What is not uncertain is that the communities in this corridor are experiencing significant tornado events at a frequency that their infrastructure, their warning culture, and their residential construction patterns were not historically designed to accommodate.
And this weekend's setup is arriving in that context. Not as an anomaly, not as an engineered event, as a high-end expression of an atmospheric environment that the research suggests may be presenting itself with increasing frequency in this region. That context does not make the storm more or less dangerous than the parameters indicate, but it is the context in which the decisions about warning communication, shelter infrastructure, and community preparedness in the Ohio Valley need to be made. The question is not just how this weekend resolves. The question is whether this weekend prompts the sustained attention this corridor's tornado risk now warrants.
The most reassuring, honest interpretation of this setup is that the atmospheric parameters, as extreme as they currently appear in the model analysis, fail to fully materialize in the way the PDS designation anticipates. And that interpretation is not a straw man. It is a real possibility that any careful reading of the evidence has to accommodate. Here is the case, stated completely and fairly. Atmospheric forecasting at the 2 to 4 day range carries irreducible uncertainty. The cap, the layer of warm air that is currently suppressing convection and allowing the atmosphere to load, may behave differently than the models project. If the cap erodes too early, convection initiates in a disorganized mode before the wind shear maximizes. Early initiation tends to produce clusters and squall lines rather than discrete supercells, and squall lines, while producing widespread severe weather, are associated with lower rates of significant and violent tornado production than discrete supercell environments. The outbreak potential depends critically on discrete initiation along the cold front during the period of peak instability. Early erosion of the cap short circuits that sequence. There is also the possibility that the upper-level jet, which is forecast to maximize over the Ohio Valley during the peak threat window, arrives slightly faster or in a slightly different position than the model consensus projects. A jet that maximizes 200 miles north of the primary warm sector does not produce the same tornado environment as one centered directly over it. The ensemble spread in the current model guidance, while showing consensus on the general parameters, does carry real positional uncertainty at the county and metro area scale. and the history of high-profile severe weather setups contains well-documented cases of operational failures to verify at the predicted level. The 2008 Midwest tornado outbreak that the SPC's high-risk area anticipated produced significant tornadoes, but fell short of the EF4 and EF5 events the parameter space suggested. 2014's significant SPC moderate risk days over the plains produced several events that verified below the forecast intensity. Forecasting is not deterministic. The tools are better than they have ever been. They are not perfect. This interpretation is not wrong. It accounts for the real uncertainty in the model guidance, the documented history of high-end setups not fully verifying, and the genuine possibility that the cap break occurs in a mode that limits the most extreme tornado outcomes. A careful person holds this interpretation in one hand, but a careful person does not let the possibility of non-verification drive their preparation decisions. Because the cost of preparing for a PDS outbreak that does not fully verify is an inconvenient afternoon and evening. The cost of not preparing for a PDS outbreak that does fully verify is something else entirely. The intermediate interpretation, where the published research, the operational data, and the documented precedents from comparable setups most directly converge, is one that I want to state with precision, because precision here is a form of respect for the people making decisions in this corridor this weekend. The weight of the evidence supports an outbreak that produces multiple significant to violent tornadoes across the Ohio Valley corridor during the peak threat window Saturday afternoon through Saturday night. Not a single tornado event, not an isolated supercell. A coordinated multi-cell outbreak environment in which several simultaneous supercells produce long-track significant tornadoes over a geographic area large enough that no single NWS office can maintain continuous focused attention on every active storm. The specific evidence pointing here is specific. CAPE values of 3,500 to 5,000 joules per kilogram, combined with SRH approaching 450 meters squared per second squared, place the current setup in the parameter space that the SPC's own climatological research associates with significant tornado outbreak environments. Not marginally. The combination of those two parameters in that range appears in a substantial fraction of the most significant outbreak days in the historical record. Harold Brooks's published work on outbreak parameter climatology establishes this connection explicitly. The April 3rd and 4th, 1974 Super Outbreak and the April 27th, 2011 outbreak both occupied broadly similar parameter space. Extreme CAPE, extreme shear, well-organized discrete supercell mode, nocturnal low-level jet acceleration, and both produced outcomes at the EF4 and EF5 level across the Ohio Valley and Southeast corridor. The current setup's atmospheric signature is not identical to either of those events. No two atmospheric configurations are identical, but the structural resemblance is meaningful. The intermediate interpretation also acknowledges the compound risks: warning saturation across multiple simultaneous supercells, the overnight threat window with degraded behavioral response, the forested, residential terrain with limited visual warning time, the infrastructure vulnerability to debris field road blockage. Each of these factors is independently documented. Together, they point to outcomes in the affected corridor that are likely to produce significant casualties and significant infrastructure damage, even if the outbreak does not reach the historical benchmark events in total tornado count or composite intensity. That is the honest landing point of the evidence as it currently exists. Multiple violent tornadoes, significant fatalities across the affected corridor. A multi-day recovery timeline in the most severely impacted counties. Not the end of the world, not a routine severe weather event. The physically possible worst case for this setup requires three things to align. The cap holds through the early to mid-afternoon, allowing the atmosphere to reach its maximum energy loading. Convection initiates in a discrete supercell mode along the approaching cold front in the late afternoon and early evening, with multiple simultaneous supercell tracks developing across the high-risk corridor. And the nocturnal low-level jet acceleration maintains and intensifies those supercells through the overnight hours, producing a second violent outbreak wave after midnight. None of those three conditions is a stretch. All three are consistent with the model guidance. All three have precedent in both the 1974 and the 2011 outbreak environments. In this scenario, the outbreak total approaches or exceeds the scale of the April 27, 2011 event in terms of significant tornado count. EF4 and EF5 tornadoes track across portions of the metro corridors of Louisville, Columbus, Cincinnati, and Indianapolis. Long track events: tornadoes maintaining ground contact for 50, 70, 100 miles or more, cross the forested, residentially dense terrain of southern Indiana, central and eastern Kentucky, and the Ohio River Valley. The specific vulnerability of this scenario relative to the 2011 benchmark is the terrain and the housing stock. The 2011 outbreak occurred primarily over the Alabama and Tennessee Valley, where tornado awareness, safe room installation rates, and community shelter culture are relatively high compared to national averages. The Ohio Valley Corridor, particularly its rapidly grown suburban and exurban zones, has lower safe room penetration, lower embedded tornado awareness, and a forested terrain that limits the visual warning time that serves as the backstop when behavioral response to official warnings is incomplete. Ted Fujita's documentation of the 1974 outbreak established that forested terrain does not protect structures from violent tornadoes. It protects the tornado from being seen. The trees absorb the light and block the sight lines right up to the moment of impact. In the worst-case scenario for this weekend, that visibility limitation, combined with overnight timing, warning saturation, and behavioral fatigue, produces fatality concentrations at the levels the historical record associates with violent tornado direct hits on sleeping residential populations. The physical ingredients are present. The worst case is not a hypothetical assembled from improbable conditions. It is a coherent scenario grounded in the observable atmospheric setup and the documented behavior of comparable historical environments. Its probability is not the highest of the three interpretations, but the potential consequences at the tail of that distribution are severe enough that the asymmetry of preparation, the low cost of preparation against the high cost of non-verification, makes it the scenario that should be driving individual behavior decisions this weekend, not the reassuring interpretation. An honest accounting. 3 categories. What is confirmed? The SPC has issued a PDS tornado watch for the Ohio Valley Corridor. The atmospheric analysis shows CAPE values of 3,500 to 5,000 joules per kilogram and SRH values approaching 450 meters squared per second squared across the warm sector, parameters that the peer-reviewed literature and the SPC's own climatological research associate with significant tornado outbreak environments. The geographic corridor includes major metropolitan areas with millions of residents in predominantly wood frame housing in forested and rolling terrain. The warning system will issue warnings. The warnings will have real lead time. Whether that lead time produces effective behavioral response across the full exposed population is genuinely uncertain. What is uncertain? The exact timing of cap break and convective initiation, whether it occurs in the discrete supercell mode that maximizes tornado potential or in a more disorganized mode that limits it. The exact track of individual supercells within the broad high-risk area, which specific counties and metro zones experience direct tornado impacts. The degree to which warning saturation and overnight timing degrade behavioral response across the exposed population. What specific information would resolve those uncertainties? The SPC mesoscale discussions, issued multiple times per day during high-impact events, will carry the most operationally current assessment of cap behavior and convective mode potential. Watch for language around discrete initiation versus linear mode in those discussions. The NWS area forecast discussions from Louisville, Indianapolis, and Pittsburgh will carry the most specific county-level timing guidance. The actual radar picture as initiation begins, whether the first storms to develop are organized supercells or disorganized clusters, is the clearest real-time signal about which branch of the forecast tree the atmosphere is following. All of this is publicly accessible. The SPC mesoscale discussions are at spc.a.gov. The NWS office discussions are at weather.gov, navigated to the specific office. The NextRad radar data is at radar.defwar.gov. You do not need a meteorology degree to read a radar image during an outbreak. You need to know whether the returns are organized, bowing, or disorganized, and what the county-level tornado warnings are showing. That information is there, real-time, in public. And for the people in the corridor who are making practical decisions this weekend, the most important piece of information is this. Do not wait for the tornado warning in your county to identify your shelter. Know where your shelter is now. Know how long it takes you to get there from every location you might occupy Saturday afternoon and Saturday night. Have a battery-powered weather radio, because the wireless emergency alert system degrades when cellular towers lose power. And treat the overnight hours, midnight to 6 in the morning Saturday night into Sunday, as a period when your personal readiness should be equivalent to your daytime readiness, not relaxed because it is dark and quiet outside. The warning system will do its job. Your job is to know what to do when it does. Here is where the investigation stands. A particularly dangerous situation tornado watch is in effect for the Ohio Valley. The atmospheric parameters behind that designation, CAPE values that place this setup in the parameter space of the historical violent outbreak environments, wind shear values at or above the threshold associated with long-track significant tornadoes, are confirmed by the operational analysis. The corridor underneath the forecast contains millions of people in forested, rolling terrain that limits visual tornado warning time, in wood frame housing that does not survive EF4 and EF5 winds intact, in a warning culture that has less embedded tornado preparedness than the traditional tornado alley communities that have faced comparable events before. The warning system is doing what it was built to do. The SPC has issued the PDS designation. The NWS offices are surge staffing. The warnings will come, and they will come with real lead time. What happens in that lead time, in the minutes between the warning and the tornado's arrival, is what determines the outcome for the families in this corridor. The three interpretations of this setup cover a range from a high-end event that does not fully verify to a significant outbreak that produces multiple violent tornadoes with serious casualties, to a worst-case scenario in which the overnight timing and the terrain and the warning saturation combine to produce fatality concentrations the Ohio Valley has not seen in the modern warning era. The data does not tell us with certainty which branch the atmosphere will follow. It tells us that all three branches are physically consistent with the observable setup.
We will be watching the cap. We will be watching the initiation mode. We will be watching the SPC mesoscale discussions and the NWS office AFDs as this event unfolds. And when it verifies, in whatever form the atmosphere chooses, we will be here with the post-event analysis, the damage surveys, the operational meteorology of what actually happened and why. But right now, before any of that, the most important thing is not the investigation. The most important thing is that the people in this corridor know where their shelter is, and that they are in it when the time comes. We'll keep watching.